Thank you, Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Greens in the Legislative Assembly to speak on the State Insurance and Care Legislation Amendment Bill and acknowledge my Greens colleague, MLC-elect Sue Higginson, who is watching this debate from the chamber and who will take carriage of these issues in this area of work when she is sworn into the New South Wales Upper House next week, taking on the mammoth task of filling the shoes of David Shoebridge, who I acknowledge has done really significant work in exposing the scandals and issues around workers' compensation, and particularly the failings of the now Premier, then Treasurer Dominic Perrottet, when it comes to the oversight of iCare. I want to also acknowledge the other member of Labor in the Upper House, Daniel Mookhey, who I understand have been working very closely with David, and recognise that the work that they have done in addition to the Labor opposition spokesperson here, who has been leading the charge when it comes to making sure that we have a workers' compensation scheme in this state that respects and reflects the dignity of people in their workplace and doesn't put the priority on large, big pay packets for those who are overseeing the scheme over and above the treatment of the workers who they are intended to serve. This bill before us implements part of the government's response to the recommendations made by the Independent Review of iCare and the State Insurance and Care Governance Act 2015, and also responds in part, if not directly, to the Legislative Council Standing Committee on Law and Justice and the review of the workers' compensation scheme that I know that my colleague David Shoebridge and Daniel Mookhey and others were instrumental in using as a way to expose the outrageous scandals that we've seen over many years in relation to iCare. And it's very easy to come in here and start talking about the machinations of a scheme, to talk about the regulations and the legislative changes that we're making, and forget the real people that are impacted by what has been the failures of this scheme in the past. And I think everyone in this chamber would have heard, and we heard even members from the government side talking about the challenges around this space, have heard directly from people in their own communities about how the failures of this system has impacted and increased the distress and trauma and frustrations on individuals who are facing the need to be able to deal with this system. It's very important that we recognise that we need to have a scheme in this state that respects the rights and the dignity of workers, but also recognises that they have already been through significant trauma, that many of these individuals want to get back to work, they want to get back to being able to do what they can do, and instead they are caught up in a horrific system that adds to the trauma. And this is not new, sadly the underfunding of certain aspects of our public service, the outsourcing of certain jobs, and the privatisation or the attempt to arm's length things actually has meant that instead of serving the community interest and the public interest, what we see is these kind of mechanisms are actually there to protect certain types of people, to prioritise the bottom line as opposed to the needs of the community. And I think one of the clear changes to this is the fact that we need to see that there needs to be a consideration in relation to decisions or directions that are made by the minister that we'll see in this legislation to consider the public interest. You would have thought that would go without saying, but I think the scandals that we've seen in this space over the last 4 or more years, a decade even, that have been exposed, demonstrate that it is absolutely necessary for this to take place. So the bill makes amendments to the State Insurance and Care Governance Act to clarify the objects and functions of iCare and State Insurance Regulatory Authority, or CIRA. In the delivery and regulation of state insurance and compensation schemes, establish a 4-year maximum term of office for an appointed director of iCare, which was previously at 3 years, and require the boards of both iCare and CIRA to advise the minister of whether it considers a ministerial direction to be in the public interest. The bill also makes amendments to the Workers' Compensation Act 1987 and Workplace Injury Management and Workers' Compensation Act 1998, with the aim of extending CIRA's investigative and regulatory powers to the nominal insurer, iCare, New South Wales Self-Insurance Corporation and claims managers, empowering CIRA to impose licence conditions on both the nominal insurer and government self-insurers with the ministerial approval, providing the settlement of some lump sum death benefit disputes in Personal Injury Commission, and providing a framework allowing the President of the Personal Injury Commission to approve commutations and to allow the regulations to expand access for commutations in certain clauses and claims. It's important that we see this legislative change in the context of which it is being brought to the chamber. And in 2020, the Law and Justice Committee conducted a review of the Workers' Compensation Scheme, and this inquiry exposed extraordinary levels of financial mismanagement and the underpayment of thousands of injured workers by iCare, and found that iCare's failures resulted in poor claims management scheme, plummeting return to work rates, and injured workers facing considerable difficulties accessing the benefits they were entitled to. The recommendations of this inquiry largely focused on internal processes of iCare, but called on the New South Wales Government to also expand the regulatory powers of the CIRA and New South Wales Treasury to make operational and administrative improvements to iCare. Now, the Greens don't oppose this legislation before us, but I do think that it is important to note that there are elements that we believe, while there are improvements that are here, there are elements that we believe in this legislation that do create a significant risk. I wish to flag or foreshadow as one of those the proposed changes to the scheme's valuations, but also what has been raised with us and has been raised by a number of members already this morning in this chamber is in relation to the additional powers that CIRA will be given, CIRA being able to be given additional directional powers, when we recognise also the concerns that have been raised directly with us, and I know with other members in this chamber, about the fact that in the briefing note we got from the government, there was sort of talking up, as they often are known to do, talking up their extensive consultation. You know, they say, oh, we've consulted broadly with all of the stakeholders, but then when you speak to certain stakeholders, they're like, we haven't heard about this, we haven't been consulted about this. So I do question, whether or not we need to make sure that the people that are gaining more power under this legislation, CIRA, are not the primary people being consulted here, and actually ask to what level there has been granular consultation with the unions that are most impacted by the kind of work, workers' compensation issues that regularly come up. And I would urge the government to recognise that if they are trying to take the politics out of this and they're trying to serve the interests of workers, our primary objective and goal should be to try and make sure that people are safe in their workplaces and they're not needing to access this scheme and services. But there is a history of the New South Wales Liberal and National Party that they are here, not to serve the interests of the people. They claim occasionally in jest on that side of the chamber to be the party of the workers, but in actual fact we all know it's full well they are the party of the bosses, and they are the parties of the people who are trying to profit out of the exploitation of workers, and that is what they will consistently do. And so we need to make sure that we hold them to account on it. It's particularly the case, and I would like to highlight the fact that there are two things that I think really need to be stressed here, that have been stressed by others in this chamber. And the first is the amount and concerns about the fact that we're considering a piece of legislation here with, once again, kicking the can down the road to the fact that all the detail will be in the regulations. Now, obviously, we have the power and the ability to be able to, in the upper house, look at disallowing regulations in the future, but that is not a good way. That is not a good way to be able to consider detailed legislation in this chamber, and especially when we're talking about having had multiple reviews that recommend certain changes, and then we have the government responding to those reviews, saying they've consulted widely, then we're here about to pass a piece of legislation that kicks the can down the road in relation to all of the regulations that we have no detail about whatsoever. I would urge the government, when they are developing those recommendations, those regulations, to make sure that they are consulting in detail with that. The Greens welcome this action from government to implement some of the recommendations, but we also express concern about the lack of consultation that's happened. We know that some of the recommendations from the McDougall Review with relevance to the New South Wales Government are not addressed in this bill, and these include a number of different measures, including implementing an appropriate legislative response to the changing nature of work and the growth of the gig economy, which would provide those workers with the benefits provided by the Workers' Compensation Scheme, and also amending the Workplace Injury Management and Workers' Compensation Act to provide for a further assessment of the whole person impairment where there is a significant deterioration in a compensable injury. Can I end by saying this, and if I can just seek the indulgence of the House for another brief 1-minute extension, Speaker?
Member for Newtown requests extension of time. All those in favour say aye. Against say no. think
Thank
the
you,
ayes have it.
Speaker.
The ayes have it.
I just want to take a final minute just to say, in conclusion, to thank all of the people that have been actively working behind the scenes in relation to trying to improve our workers' compensation scheme and to try and look to make sure that there is oversight. I want to acknowledge the contributions that Unions New South Wales and the CFMEU particularly have made. I want to acknowledge the fact that there are experts in this space that have worked closely with my colleague David Shoebridge over many years to feed in their expertise to expose the scandals that have been shamefully overseen by the current Premier, then Treasurer Dominic Perrottet, when he had responsibility for this. And I want to say to all of the workers who are facing the challenges around dealing right now with the dysfunctional scheme and the desire of them to have a scheme that works better for them and their community, that the Greens are committed to ensuring that no worker is injured or dies as a result of a workplace incident. We absolutely support the strengthening of protections for workers, the strong role of unions, and the ability for workers to engage in collective industrial action and strikes to protect workplace conditions. Because first and foremost, we should be making sure that we are doing all that we can to protect people when they are at work, so that they are not injured and harmed, so that they are not needing to access this scheme. That is the ideal option. But the secondary option, if we have to have it, is to ensure that there is a scheme that treats the people that are engaging with this scheme in a way that is with dignity and with respect. And I think most people who have had the experience of engaging to date have not had that. And we have an absolute commitment to making sure that we do that. And we very much look forward to looking in detail at the Labor amendments. I can say that from what the Greens have heard, the Greens will be supporting the Labor amendments. Anything that we can do to try and strengthen the detail in legislation as opposed to put it further into regulations is very welcome. The New South Wales Bar Association has said a damning critique of the ongoing habit of the New South Wales government when it comes to these issues. It is something that has to be addressed, and we will then be looking at whether or not we will be seeking to move further amendments in the other place in line with the issues raised by stakeholders that unfortunately were not consulted by this Liberal National Government, because they seem to be able to pick and choose the people who will tell them what they want to hear when it comes to consulting with the community.